started, we're going to talk about conversation starters. This strategy is great for nonverbal kids or kids that don't speak your language. It's really good for a warm-up, building rapport, and a transition if you don't know what else to say. This might sound a little familiar if you think back all the way to our first two strategies, which were sound play and gestures. So this kind of fits in with that a little bit of it's really good for people who have low language, who might be a little bit shy, who you need to warm up with a little bit, and if you're just kind of stuck and don't really know what else to do. So the way that you're going to use this strategy is that instead of asking a closed-ended question, right, which requires a 1 or 2 word response, you're going to ask an open-ended question. And I'm sure that you guys, especially if you've been involved in some kind of recruitment or presentations in class that you want responses back, you're used to asking these open-ended questions instead of closed-ended questions. So for example, a closed-ended question is, what's your favorite color? Or here, what's that? And an open-ended question is more like, I wonder what'll happen next. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the child's going to answer every time you try to use this strategy, but it opens the door and gives them permission to kind of add more, especially if you're pairing it with something like a gesture or a change in pitch, tone, facial expression that's going to hint to the child that you're expecting something of them. And a lot of them will come up with an answer even if they don't really know what to say either. It's a really great time to use or it's a really great strategy to use when you're reading books together, playing together, or in dramatic play. Those are probably the best times to use it because I feel like there are better strategies to use during breakfast time, such as self-talk or parallel talk, which is going to provide a little bit more rich language than in some of these other settings. So the way that you're going to use this strategy is you're going to, as I said, ask open-ended questions to encourage the child to talk. Really what we're trying to do is create a safe, open space for them to say what's on their mind. And there's no right or wrong answers to these questions. You want to be sure that when you're asking them, you frame them in a way that it appears non-judgmental and you're not quizzing them, you're not testing them, it just is providing an opportunity for them. And you want to make sure that they're feeling very warm, safe, and you want to try to use this more when you kind of have built a little bit of rapport with the child. So although it's a really good strategy to start a conversation, especially for children with low language, this might not be like the very first strategy that I would use. So the way you're going to use it is you're going to make statements related to the current activity that you're doing, similar to most of our strategies, right? You want it to be something in the environment that the child can see, can interact with, and then you're going to relate the child's point of view and their life to what's going on here in the environment, right? And so, as I said earlier, the child might not answer the question, especially if it's a question that, first of all, they don't know if you're asking it because you didn't really pair it with a gesture or facial expression, or if they have very low language, they might not know how to answer it, especially at first. And so you're going to want to model your answer. So if you were going to answer, what would you say? And then the more often that you model and the child starts to understand the strategy and what's going on, they're going to start using or responding to the questions. They probably won't ask the questions themselves, but it's a way to facilitate their language, right? So here are some really great examples. This is one of the more complicated strategies to wrap your head around because it doesn't come as naturally as some of the other ones might, at least for me personally, right? So some of the other ones that we've talked about are, repetition and revision, gesturing, and making play sounds. And so for those, it's very much like the child says something and you respond, or you're just adding some movement to what you're saying, or you're making a sound, which everybody has done sometime in their life. But not everybody has done this. Not everybody has had to ask a really good open-ended question. And the first couple times you do it, you're going to ask a closed-ended question by accident, and you're maybe not going to be clear of your expectations of the child, and they might not really understand how to respond to it, and that might feel awkward for you. But just remember that you're in charge in this situation, right? So even if you accidentally ask a closed-ended question and the child responds with 1 or 2 words, they never knew it was supposed to be open-ended. And if you ask the question and they don't respond, like I just said, you respond back, you answer the question, and then you could always ask, what about you? Or what are your thoughts on that? And that'll kind of encourage them to answer. And then the more often you do it, first of all, it's going to feel more natural for you. And second of all, the child's going to kind of get what's going on and start responding more often. So for this first example, I'll move my video for me. I don't know if it's moving for you, but the first example is, I wonder what she's feeling. And that's kind of a deep question. At first glance, you might think, oh, like they're just going to answer happy or sad. But the thing is that if you say, I wonder what she's feeling, and the child says, oh, like she's sad, and you could be like, why do you think that? And then that's going to open up the child to be like, oh, well, she dropped her pizza, and that's really sad. And then you can lead into another conversation of, that is really sad. Have you ever dropped your pizza? And right there, that's a closed-ended question. That's a yes or no question. And the child might just say no. They might say yes. But either way, then you back it up with, tell me about it, right? That's one of my favorite strategies is, tell me about it, or tell me more. I feel like that's probably my favorite way to use this strategy. But again, this isn't one that I personally use a lot, and that doesn't mean it's not a good strategy. It's a great strategy, and all of you should be using this strategy if you can and if you feel comfortable with it, or at least try it out even if you don't feel comfortable at first, because the whole point of this is to learn different ways to facilitate language and benefit the child in as many different ways as possible. So a couple of other examples are, I bet you have lots of books at home. And this one is not a question, right? These are all statements. And a note here at the bottom is, these require more complex answers, right? So if you want a little bit of a less complex answer, if it's a child who doesn't have a lot of language, you might want to actually have a question. But if you do have a child that has a little bit more language, or you feel like they've started understanding the strategy more, you can start using statement questions, because it's going to open the door for a conversation at the end of the day. So I bet you have a lot of books at home. They're going to say, yeah, I have tons, and I love this book, and I love this book. Or if they do answer, yeah, or no, or I guess, you can, again, always say, oh, tell me more. You have a lot of like, what's your favorite book? Tell me more about it. What happens? Who's your favorite character in a book, right? And make sure that you're just feeling really engaged with the child, letting them know that you're listening and this is a safe space for them. Because at the end of the day, these children don't have a lot of language, the ones that we're working with at Rosa Parks at least. And we want to make sure that they feel like they have an open space to talk without judgment. The last couple examples, I wonder what happens in The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and I bet you wear costumes at home too. And you can see from these statements that it's just sort of starting a conversation. That's why it's called Conversation Starters. If you do want a little bit more of information about this topic, feel free to reach out to your coach, because this is a little bit more of a complicated strategy, and we can talk more about this in small group if you still have some questions and feel like some things aren't clear with this strategy. I can add a document to the Canvas page as well with a bunch of conversation starter phrases. So you see here that we've used a couple of I wonder and I bet, but there are a lot more that you can implement, and maybe it'll be helpful for you guys if you have a list of those, so that you can kind of default to certain verbs, which might help.